course, after 5 years off of YouTube completely, I decided to come back and fire shots at romantasy. That's how I'm starting. I'm starting by going, romantasy isn't real. I mean, it is real, but it doesn't mean it's good. Hi, I'm Charlie. I was popular on BookTube about 15 years ago, but I am trying to get back into it because I think that BookTube and BookTok and Bookstagram need mature voices. They need neurodivergent voices, and I have both of those. I have done an extremely deep dive into why romantasy happened, why it is absolutely everywhere. You cannot escape it. You walk into any bookshop, there's piles, there's tables, there's shelves full of romantasy books. You go onto Amazon, if you read anything, romantasy will somehow end up being recommended to you. If you're on a social media platform and you're looking at book stuff, you will end up looking at romantasy stuff. Even you logged into YouTube today thinking that you were going to see a normal video, you in fact see a video from me talking about romantasy. You didn't expect that today, but that's what's happening because I have researched this until I can see it everywhere. I can see the patterns forming in my head of how this happened, and it's fascinating to me because I love fantasy. I have loved fantasy growing up. Ever since I was tiny, I loved fantasy novels and fantasy worlds, and I guess I am a bit of a romantic, so in theory romantasy is perfect for me. So why do I feel so disconnected from it? Why does it not click something in my head? Why doesn't it spark some kind of joy up in here? Why is this the third time that I'm trying to read A Court of Thorns and Roses and I cannot finish it? I can't do it. Why is that? So romantasy as a genre term, as a portmanteau of romance and fantasy, came about in around 2008. This was when The Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas, pictured here behind me, was in its first sort of promotional cycle, and it was coined by the publishing team and marketing team to promote it, and it wasn't anything particularly groundbreaking. Like, they didn't realize it at the time. It's a bit like, you know, when they were making Star Wars, they didn't realize it was going to be a genre defining movie. They didn't realize this was going to be a genre defining book, but it turned out to be. And yet again, in the year of 2026, we are getting more Sarah J Maas news. For good or bad, we are getting more books in the series, and of course with the new releases means the older releases will be bumped back up the bestseller charts, and it will spur on possibly more romantasy books, which I don't know how that's going to be possible with such an oversaturated market, but in order to go forward with the genre, we need to go way back and figure out where it came from in the first place. Fantasy as a genre can be traced back to myths and legends, spoken stories told through generations. So we're talking, I mean, everything will go back to the ancient Greeks. Anything, you can pretty much root it back to those guys, so good for them, I guess, but for the purpose of this video, you're gonna hear a bit from them, so make peace with that. There is even a branch of romantasy which is dedicated to romantasy style retellings of ancient Greek myths and legends. It's a whole romantasy genre within the romantasy genre. The modern fantasy that you and I would recognise as modern fantasy started in about the 1800s. And really what I'm using as a definition of a fantasy novel or a fantasy book is a story that takes place in a different world. It doesn't take part in Earth as we know it. It takes place in a completely different not necessarily time, but a completely different place, a completely new, made up world. So, for example, the fantasy worlds of Wonderland in Alice in Wonderland and Neverland in Peter Pan, they didn't have to abide by the rules of Earth, as we know the certain rules that stories have to follow, the things that have to happen. Whereas if you are setting a book in a completely different time and place, you can be a bit more free and a bit more psychedelic, I guess, a bit fanciful, fantastic, I guess. You can use a bit more imagination with things because you don't have to abide by the rules that we know. Reading this kind of fantasy book for the first time would have been quite jarring or quite interesting because it was a complete escape. It wasn't just an escape to a familiar place with unfamiliar names, but a completely different place, completely different rules, and you could just lose yourself in the story without thinking about if it's plausible or if it's even possible. Was the popularity of pulp fiction, not the Foot Guy thing, but the other pulp fiction, the tiny little books that were published in the 1920s to around the 1960s. They were small, very cheap to publish, very cheap to buy, and they were really the cornerstone of bringing fantasy to the everyday casual reader. In the 1920s, the popularity of authors like Robert E. Howard, who published the Conan the Barbarian comics, and Conan really cemented that idea of a barbarian, that kind of muscle-bound, not too bright, kind of a himbo, long hair, big sword, go to save the day, very strong, cool guy. He basically invented that and popularized it as a recognizable character as its own thing. Oh yeah, that's a barbarian. That is what a barbarian looks like. That is how a barbarian acts. And Edgar Rice Burroughs also did Tarzan and John Carter of Mars. From Mars, of Mars. I mean, I guess they're both the same kind of word. He's off from Mars. Delete as applicable. And it is definitely of note the fact that these authors were paid more if their artwork featured naked women, or at least very partially clothed women. So if your story got onto the front page and got the full artwork, you were paid more, and therefore there was more incentive to put not only female characters, but female characters in distress. Nude female characters in distress. There was an incentive to put romance with the fantasy on the cover of the book because it sold more. This blossomed into the subgenre of sword and sorcery. One of my favourite genres, and something that I really hope makes a big comeback at the end of this kind of romantasy arc. I really hope sword and sorcery makes a return to popularity because it's so much fun, and it's ridiculous, sure, but it is fun at its essence. The difference between sword and sorcery and general fantasy, or even high fantasy, is that sword and sorcery really follows the hero's journey and the story is put through a much smaller lens. It is their story. It follows them on a day-to-day basis, and you may not know a lot about the other politics or things going on in the world. Like Game of Thrones, you have lots of things happening, lots of characters. You understand the world as a complete being. In sword and sorcery, it's much more pinpointed to that person's experience, and it feels a lot more personal. It kind of feels like having a chat with an old friend telling you their war stories, rather than reading something a scribe would have written about the adventures of the many knights. It was just one dude and maybe a weird pet going along for an odd journey where he doesn't really know the big people in charge, he doesn't really know the full stakes of what's going on, but he's relatable. He's a friend, but he's the best friend you could ask for because he is brave and he gets the girl. Overall, Sword and Sorcery felt more like a genre of the people, the working man's fantasy book, because you didn't hear about the kings and the politics of the world. You heard about this one guy who was saving the people around him, saving his village, saving his friends. It felt more personal. Although at this time, during the 50s, there was another branch of fantasy happening concurrently, and that is high fantasy. And so of course we have to talk about the king of high fantasy in the 1950s, which of course is J.R. Tolkien. But to really piss him off, to piss his ghost off, I'm going to talk about C.S. Lewis first.
Hooray!
Because I was a Chronicles of Narnia girly growing up. I loved those books. I read them until they fell apart. So I'm going to talk about C.S. Lewis first. I know, problematic king? Question mark? The Chronicles of Narnia was different to other high fantasies because of the fact it was aimed at a younger audience. Fantasy up until that point had been pretty much exclusively for adults. You had the outliers of things like Peter Pan that were aimed at kids. But this wasn't a fun fairy tale story where everything was kind of always going to be fine. This was harrowing. This was kids being forced into an adventure. And it also cemented the typical person from ordinary world being transported into other world and then thrust onto a throne. Familiar? It's every romantasy book now, apparently. I mean, this girl did it. If you think about the time when the Chronicles of Narnia was published, this was immediately post World War II, and there were so many traumatized adults who were children in World War II, and to have this story where children were the main character, the heroes, villains sometimes, but they were brave, they were respected, and they were also evacuees. They had been through something that they had been through as a child, and then they were able to read that story to their children to help them understand. It was a real kind of group therapy moment for boomers everywhere. Oh, how I wish it had worked a bit better. It didn't. It was a massive world, may have had messages about Christianity, although that's debated. I tried to look into it and it hurt my head, so I decided to leave it out. So if anyone wonders why I'm not bringing up that, I would love to do a video more about C.S. Lewis, because he's a fascinating man, and his beef with J.R. Tolkien. I would love to talk about that because it goes deep. Speaking of Tolkien, we have to talk about Lord of the Rings, because if we're talking about fantasy, we have to talk about the godfather of fantasy, Tolkien. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings and published Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, published The Hobbit first, then published trilogy. That trilogy came out within like 1 year. So the Sunday Times has this fantastic quote: "The English-speaking world is divided into those who have read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and those who are going to read them." That is how iconic this fantasy book is. This tiny genre that was seen as very niche is now the biggest selling book and like the must-read book of the century. This wasn't a detective novel, a romance novel. It was very specifically a high fantasy book. Something that was niche is now huge. It was a big deal. In the decades that followed Lord of the Rings, there were so much more fantasy books being given a chance in the publishing world. There was The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks in 1977, which was a overwhelming bestseller. It was incredibly popular. I haven't read it, but maybe I will. Should I? The 1980s saw massive popularity with my boy here, Terry Pratchett, and also The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, and The Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. He's down here. You can't see him. He's hidden in shame because I've only read the first one. And this also transferred to movies and TV shows like Xena. You had all the sword and sorcery films. You had Beastmaster, which is a fantastic movie. You should definitely watch it. Deathstalkers. There's literally so many sword and sorcery films that came out at that point. But this showed that the public as a whole had a desire to watch fantasy, to read fantasy. It was no longer niche. It was mainstream popular. It wasn't weird to like fantasy. If your granddad said that he'd read Lord of the Rings, you're not gonna point and laugh and nerd. It's just normal that people like fantasy. There was, however, a massive divide in that popularity, and everyone's like, yay, everyone likes fantasy now. There was one type of person that wasn't really invited to the party, and that was 51% of the population: women. Women were not really included in these stories in a hero role. They were dressed in tiny bikinis and seen as frankly a liability. They would get kidnapped, they would deceive people, they were either evil or idiots. That was a woman's role in fantasy for quite a while, and that sucks. But there was a group of female writers who were working to write iconic fantasy fiction. I made a list so I didn't forget any of them. So you had people like Ursula K. Le Guin, Mercedes Lackey, Anne McCaffrey, Catherine Kerr, Marion Zimmer Bradley, and Barbara Hamley. They were out there writing these books for the little girls that loved fantasy, for the teenage girls that loved fantasy, for the housewives that loved fantasy, that wanted to join in with the things that they saw their brothers, their husbands, their fathers do. But they didn't see themselves in the literature. They didn't see the strong girl barbarian with a sword. They just saw the booby lady. You're the booby lady. I mean, imagine loving a genre so much and you're designated to booby lady. It sucks. By the way, if you do want me to read any of these authors' works and talk about them, I literally need just one person to say please do it, and I will absolutely dedicate every minute of my spare time to making that happen, because I mean, I'm easily convinced, because I do want to do it already, but I feel like if I have someone be like, do that for a video, I have to. It's for you, not for me. But let's not forget why we're here. We're here for romantasy, not just fantasy. We're here for everything, which means we need to talk about the other part of romantasy, which is the romance. We need to talk about love. The origins of the romance story, as you can guess, is ancient Greece, because they were horny. But in researching this video, I found some horrible things. Not about the ancient Greeks, although I'm sure there's many horrible things about them, but specifically the first widely publicized and very popular romance book. Just bear with me for this next bit because it's going to get rough. So it was called Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, and that was by Samuel Richardson in 1740. This was a book about... I had never heard of this book. This was completely new to me. So I was going in all naive, laughing through the fields, like, this is gonna be so cute and fun. It was not cute and fun. The novel is written from the point of view of a 15-year-old girl. That's our first warning as to how this isn't going to be a fun time, by the way. She's being seduced by her employer after harassing, sexually assaulting, and kidnapping her. He reforms his ways and they get married. Now, I have two things to say about this. First of all, I feel incredibly sorry for the women around in 1740 who were like, a romance book? Say less. Sign me up. Get me that romance book. I want to read about being wooed. I want to read about a man sweeping me off my feet. Oh, this sounds really cool. And then having to read that about a child being assaulted, kidnapped by her employer, the man of the manor, and him being like, I'm so sorry, babe, I didn't mean any of that, will you like marry me or something? And her being like, so I feel incredibly sorry for those women. Second, this was an incredibly popular book. It was 1740s viral. They had merch. That shocked me. They had merch of this weird romance book. They had merch. They had plays where people would reenact scenes from the book. They had reading parties where they basically would have, because literacy wasn't great everywhere, so they would have like the person who knew how to read would read out loud the book to people listening, and apparently people would run around screaming and yelling and celebrating at the end when there was like the wedding. Insane behavior. But then I look at some of the books that I read and I think, if in 300 years time people are like, why did my great grandmother read all that monster smart? And I'll be like, it was fun. It was funny. It was a little bit funny though. Moving on to slightly nicer, much nicer pastures. We are leaving that book in the history books. Whilst it was the first widely published romance book, thankfully we did move on from that, mostly. We have Austen and the Brontes. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this because I am not, but for context of any people who want to know, Jane Austen is Sabrina Carpenter. The Brontes are Ethel Cain. I rest my case. To this day, you still have the Brontes' weird girl, obsessive romance, and then you still have the climbing up the socialite ladder, talking about how relationships affect you as a person and affect you as a society kind of books. These stereotypes and these two things still exist. We never get better, we just get different. In 1908, a friendship formed that would change our grandmothers forever. Mills and Boons was formed in 1908 by two men who worked already in publishing, but it wasn't until the 1930s, when they saw the success of their first romance publication, that they realized that women were horny. Those housewives were kind of desperate for it, and they had money for the first time. If you think post-war, especially when these publications were starting to go out into the real world, into like supermarkets and pharmacies and the post office, places like that, our grandmothers or women alive in the 1940s and 50s and 60s would have had money for their own money for the first time. This was huge. Even if they didn't have their own money, they were able to go out to places where they already were shopping and buy books, cheap books, well written. That's a different debate. But they were able to access books solely for their own enjoyment, for their own pleasure, and it was an escape because, let's face it, if you were married in the 1940s to 1960s, there may be a chance that your husband wasn't fantastic to you, and maybe you needed a sweet little romance book to get you through the day, or maybe your husband was away somewhere and it got you through the night. This trend carried on to the 1970s when you had the bodice ripper books. These are the ones that I think of when I think of like Mills and Boon's books, because they were so iconic and they were so recognizable. And I know there are some romance authors that hate the term bodice rippers. Apparently, I learned that whilst researching this, which is crazy because sometimes they're literally ripping the bodice on the front cover. I feel like it describes it pretty well. These were the darker, edgier kind of Mills and Boon's books where there was genuine peril. These weren't just meet cutes that turned into happy endings. There was longing, there was danger, it was real life scenarios and situations. Apparently pirates were really popular for bodice ripper books. I again had no idea until I researched this, but pirates were huge. They loved a pirate, and I get it. I saw Pirates of the Caribbean at a very young age. I had feelings for Keira Knightley, especially in the later ones where she's dressed like a boy. These books also featured open door sex scenes. So these were romance scenes where you didn't necessarily get a lot of detail, but you were privy to seeing what was going on, to being aware of what was happening, whereas previously in Mills and Boon's books you didn't get those kind of descriptions. You just got a fade to black when they started getting hot and heavy. It was actually a lot more tame than I think the general zeitgeist remembers. I think we think that they were incredibly saucy and they were incredibly like lots of descriptions of things going on, but actually they were pretty tame. Like, you didn't get open door sex scenes, you didn't get descriptions, because they didn't really need it. They didn't have that exposure to stuff that was scandalous enough for them to do whatever, I guess. There was another coincidence happening with this bodice ripper type book, is that the men featured in these books were muscle bound, they usually had long hair, they were usually very brave, and they usually had swords. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, it's basically a barbarian. At the same time that these small paperback fun little sword and sorcery books were coming out, the women were looking at that going, nice. It's absolutely fascinating to see the levels of publishing and how in one world the publishing was just doing it from the male point of view of being the super strong, brave guy, kind of an idiot, saving the girl, and the girls were like, okay, but what if he had emotional depth? Hear me out. What if he was nice? What if he was nice to me? Fantasy. In the 1980s, the romance field changed again with things like Jilly Cooper's Riders, because the settings were no longer fantastical or set around the world. They were present day, and they were places that were, I mean, not necessarily familiar to everyone, but familiar enough. There were two other major differences. First of all, the heroines were in charge. The women had power, the women had agency, and they had an openness with their sexuality that really reflected the women's lib movement, where people were talking about, you know, the fact that women weren't equal participant in sex and maybe should enjoy it as well. The other difference is that this featured not only open door sex scenes but detailed sex scenes. You were getting the descriptions multiple times, not even necessary to the plot, it was just in there, and it was sexy and steamy, and it was incredibly popular. I think every doctor's surgery and charity shop when I was growing up had a copy of Ginny Cooper's Riders in it, because every mum had read it at some point and then passed it on to someone else, and everyone knew it. Everyone knew it, and everyone thought it was just incredibly sexy, and it was the must read thing. And I would be very interested to read it to see if it is as saucy as, see, I don't like using the term spicy, I prefer saying saucy, because I think spicy just feels American, whereas saucy feels British. I am British, why am I doing a British accent? If you look at these two timelines together, you'll see that they really kind of grew up together. Not exactly the same, but incredibly similar. Starting off in ancient Greece and then telling through myths and legends and word of mouth, through to very traditional publishing, and then through to pulp publishing, small publications, having to survive through wars and poverty and down spirits of the masses, but keeping going to try and cheer people up, try and keep fantasy alive, try and keep the human spirit alive. Now we land in modern era where they seem to have just converged together. They of course do exist separately still, but there is a new timeline that has formed, a convergence of the two things, with a new one slap bang in the middle. Romantasy. We're back at romantasy. There are some distinct differences between the two genres, romance and fantasy. Romance is set through a very narrow lens. They are tales of stories between usually two people or a very small group of people. You aren't typically aware of the politics and surrounding area. You may not have descriptions of the area, the setting of the book at all, because it doesn't matter. That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the feelings, the emotions, the speeches, the way you talk to each other, the way you interact with each other, the consequences of your actions towards this other person. It's a very small story with big impact. It's a very narrow lens. It's a one shot tiny room. It's intense, but it's small. Fantasy has usually the opposite problem. It focuses less on the smaller actions of a person and more of the bigger actions of groups of people, like armies or races, religion, politics. It's much more big picture. It doesn't necessarily zero in on any one character. It may feature many characters, or if it does feature one character, it has a whole cast of people helping tell the story of this very large world with lots of different rules, lots of different meanings for things. It's a big production that doesn't necessarily focus in on the details of the individual person's thoughts, feelings, desires. May come up, but it's not the focus. The focus is, look at this big crazy world that this person is trying to navigate, look at all of the different fantastical things that they are having to deal with, and less about their individual journey day to day. Fantasy often lacks the human touch. I think that's why lots of people struggle to read high fantasy, is because there is so much world building, info dumping essentially about the world, because you have to build that in your mind from scratch. Romance doesn't have that. It's usually set just in real world, just maybe in a different time period or different area that you're used to, but it's still something that's vaguely familiar to you. So overall, the difference between romance and fantasy is how big of an importance the self is. Romance is kind of all about the self and how it interacts with the immediate people around it, whereas fantasy is how the world interacts with the self. The world is almost the main character, and you, the reader, and sometimes the main character, is just kind of moving through that world and exploring it. But when you mix them together, something really beautiful happens. Say a sword fight is happening. You're 100 pages into a book, the main character is in this sword fight. You know they're going to be fine. You're 100 pages in, you're a sixth of the way into the first book of a fantasy book. Things are going to be fine. You know that. It's going to be fine. But what if this main character had a romantic interest in that fight as well? Suddenly there is real peril. If your romantic interest in this book dies, could this change the way the book goes? Will you recover from this heartbreak? Will you find love again? It brings a personal element to a fight and makes it more believable to want to read a fight. Romantasy brings these elements together, in theory, perfectly, because we're adding peril to romance and we're adding personality and personability to fantasy. In theory, this should have worked perfectly. In 2020, reading as a hobby really skyrocketed in popularity. BookTok became huge. Bookstagram, huge. BookTube, huge. It was just as much of a hobby to read books as it was to buy books, which is a different video, which I definitely want to make. It's fascinating. But books and reading were the hobby because we had a lot of time on our hands. If we weren't an emergency worker, if we were just at home a lot of the time, reading takes up a lot of time. It's a good way to use up a couple of hours between things, reading, and it's a good escape. So I think it was the perfect hobby for that time. And I think if we look historically back to when fantasy and romance really picked up their popularity, we will see a pattern of hardship. Back in wartime, when we really needed a boost as a country, things like detective novels, fantasy novels, romance novels, these were things that people reached for because they wanted to feel in control, they wanted to feel brave, they wanted to feel smart, and they wanted to feel seen, they wanted to feel loved. These books gave them that, and they were able to access them very easily. The general public were able to get them, and it made them feel something that they needed to feel. And I think in 2020, when the popularity of romantasy was really starting to really go up, I think that says a lot about where we were as a society, because women were feeling incredibly disenfranchised. There were things happening all over the world that meant that women were not feeling strong. Lockdown was especially difficult for a lot of women, and I think having an escape to live in the brain of someone who may have been seen as weak, may have been seen as not enough, but to see their journey to them being strong, to them being the strongest person in a generation, as crazy as it was, it felt good to stand in the shoes of someone who was strong, who was capable, who was loved. So let's go back to the question at hand. Why is everything romantasy? And I think there are a few answers to that question. One of them is that romantasy is kind of a catch-all label now, and not one that is necessarily genuine. There are so many books out there that are being labelled as romantasy that they're just simply not romantasy. They are fantasy in which one of the characters has a relationship with another. That doesn't necessarily constitute romantasy, it's just fantasy where people have relationships. There are romance books set in different eras, but not necessarily a fantasy world, that are being labelled as romantasy. There are books that don't feature romance at all, but are set in a fantasy setting, that have somehow fallen into a romantasy category because of the time it was published and the recognition of the author's name. I'm essentially thinking of the Poppy War, which I went into thinking, oh, I've seen a lot of people put this on their romantasy list, and then I read it and oh my god, that wasn't romantasy, it was fantasy. Yes. Harrowing also, yes, it was an incredible book, but if you're going into that thinking that you're getting Fourth Wing, you're going to be incredibly shocked. So my partner actually has a word for this. It's called fish kebab. Bear with me. Imagine you are at a buffet and you are picking up lots of different food, and you pick up what you think is a chicken kebab, like a chicken skewer, and then you go back to your table and you eat it, and it's a fish kebab. You like fish, you like fish kebabs, but it's not what you were expecting. You were expecting a chicken kebab. So you're shocked, not necessarily disgusted, but you were shocked. I think that happens a lot with people picking up what they think is romantasy and it turning out to just be fantasy, or to just be romance, or to be a secret third thing. There are so many genres that are being placed into romantasy because romantasy is popular. So for this next bit I am going to have to read because it's got numbers in it and I'm not good with remembering numbers. So there is a gender reading gap, and this has been probably a huge factor in the way that romantasy has been so popular recently. According to the 2022 survey of public participation in the arts, 54.6% of women have read a novel or short story in the last year, compared to 35.1% of men. Romantasy expands the fantasy reader's audience because they may have been a bit apprehensive to read male writers' works of fantasy fiction, because you kind of know that fantasy books don't necessarily cater a lot to women or aren't very kind to their female characters. And there is also a viral aspect to BookTok, BookTube and Bookstagram, is the collecting aspect, the fact that romantasy has become kind of a hobby within a hobby. It's become a hobby within itself to collect all the special editions of certain books, to collect signed editions, sprayed edges, all of these different special editions, and they are usually of romantasy books because they are popular. Lots of people like special editions, make special editions of romantasy ones, sell more of those. It's a snake eating its own tail. People love buying romantasy stuff and romantasy themed things too. I see this every time I go to any kind of craft fair or convention or anything. There's a lot of stalls catered to romantasy readers. Much like the women of the 1960s, these women have disposable income and they are using it to buy stuff that they like to read, only capitalism has made it into almost a sport at this point, because you are having to buy 4 editions of the same book, one with sprayed edges, one with foil, one hardback, one paperback. It's seeing some people's collections is truly insane. I know I look a bit of a hypocrite, but honestly most of these were bought in a charity shop, so I'm cheap. So it feels like the publishing world is sat figuring out where to go next, what to do next. How do they manage the romantasy problem? It's gone viral, it's had its massive day in the spotlight, it's had its 15 minutes, but can it stay there? Are people gonna get sick of it? Are readers gonna get sick of it? Are writers gonna get sick of making it? We're not sure. So sub-genres seem to be doing very well at the moment. So you think very specific sub-genres of romantasy. So things like fae, like fae specific romantasy books, myth retellings, and also incredibly popular. And then you kind of veer over to monster stuff, which is, I guess, my specialty. Until another genre comes along and takes the spotlight away from romantasy, we're just kind of cooking spaghetti and throwing it at a wall and seeing if it's cooked yet, and nothing seems quite right yet. We have things like weird girl lit, which has been definitely the up and coming genre of the last, I'd say, like 2 years, and something that I really enjoy. I love weird stuff, so that kind of works perfect for me. And things like monster smut are again increasing in popularity and becoming more mainstream. Like seeing these books in your local bookstore is something that I could not have imagined happening like 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So it's crazy to see how popular it's getting over the last couple of years. So maybe there will be room for that. Again, it's the Brontes Austen thing. Like, we're gonna get the light stuff, we're gonna get the dark stuff. I just always tend to err on the side of weird, so that's kind of what I'm aware of. So we don't know what's happening with romantasy. We don't know whether it will stay popular. We don't know whether it will just fall off the edge of the earth, like when we were into YA as teenagers and then suddenly they kind of all disappeared for a while. We don't know if that will happen, but what is most important is to remember where it came from. It came from weird little guys and weird little girls. There are some emerging genres that I believe that romantasy readers would really enjoy, because if you like the darker fantasy weird side of romantasy, then you might like weird girl fiction or monster romance, and these are genres that are largely self-published and definitely not getting the same amount of viewership as romantasy does. If you find one factor of romantasy that you really like and delve into that as a genre, you will find so much more. We need to go way back to the ways of our forefathers in publishing and look for the self-published, look for the weird little books that have no ratings. Just because something has no ratings doesn't mean that it's bad, it just means that people haven't read it yet. You can be the first person to read it. You can be the person to support that indie author that you think they look kind of cool, and you can support them. They could be the next big author that you love, and you could be the one to do it. Personally, I believe that romantasy will divorce again and it will go back to being fantasy and romance, but maybe learning some of the lessons that they met when they were together as romantasy. Maybe fantasy will include more personal stories and more strong women in their characters and a more diverse crowd of characters, and romance will feature more world building, will have a more eclectic set of characters, have side characters, have subplots, have much more interesting storylines happening within it. I do believe that readers will pick what they loved in romantasy and go further into those genres, as opposed to romantasy staying the same and people reading the same. People crave different things, and for a genre to stay at the top of its game for this long generally means that fizzing out is happening. But it will be interesting to see, obviously, with Sarah J Maas releasing her new book, Rebecca Yarros releasing, I think she's releasing another book, or she's writing another book. So it will be interesting to see how these kind of giants of romantasy deal with maybe people getting a bit sick of the genre or not loving it as much as they did 6 years ago. So that didn't really answer why is everything romantasy. I think I tried my best to answer why everything is romantasy, and the answer is because it is right now. It is right now, but I don't think it will be forever. So let me know if you liked this. I really enjoyed researching this. If you do want to see videos about the female fantasy authors, I would love to do a deep dive on them. If you want me to do more research or another video on any of the subjects that I talked about, I would absolutely love to, because these are all things I'm really interested in, so I would love to talk about it. I have some other videos that I'm planning at the moment. But if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments, because I will read and reply to every comment. I love hearing from people. Let me know if you used to watch my old videos as well, if you're like here. That was good.
Edit me out.
I will. No, I'm okay. I'm okay. I just need to get over myself a little bit, you know. I mean, you've seen me the floor.
I really hope you don't edit that bit out.
No context.